Hello everyone, welcome back to Microeconomics. So today we are going to go through this chapter of monopoly. So in today's lecture, we are going to define what is a monopoly, and we are going to talk about the details of the monopoly markets, especially the barrier to entries, and we will talk about the profit maximizing output decisions of the monopoly firm. And we will also go over the efficiency issues in the monopoly markets. We will have the second part of the videos to talk about the price discrimination strategies of the monopoly firm, and also the imperfect markets policy. So just like the previous, we can actually describe the monopoly market using this diagram here. So there are two criteria that we can use to define the monopoly markets, which is completely opposite to the perfect competitions market. So in the monopoly market, the total number of firms will only have one, and the market power for this one particular firm will be extremely large. So that means this one particular firm in the industry can actually set prices for their products. But there are some of the assumptions for the monopoly markets which is very different to the perfect competition markets that we described last time. So assumption number one, there is only one seller and one producer in this market. So this one firm basically represents the whole industry. And number two, the single seller in this market is selling a product that people cannot find close substitutes to. So what it means is this producer is actually producing a product and selling a product that has no close substitutes or anything looks like or can replace it in the market. As a consumer, if you want to buy this one unique product from the market, you have to always buy this from this one particular seller. And number three, there is an extremely high barrier to entries for the monopoly market. And it's so high that this barrier to entry will actually block every firms to go into this market. So very, very unlike to the perfect competition markets, where firms can at any time at their wills to enter or exit the market. But in the monopoly setting, we assume that there is a very high wall or barriers that block out other competitors. There are two types of monopolies that you usually see in the reality. One is called the natural monopoly, and the other one called the legal monopoly. And we would like to understand what the difference between the two. So again, comparing to the perfect competitions, the perfect competitive market, it's always a fairy tale. There is no such market exists in the reality. However, the monopoly market is actually the one that exists in the world. Well, let's talk about how the barriers to entry will define the types of monopoly. So the legal monopoly, it's basically created by the legal barrier. So some of these barriers include public franchise, patent law, and government licensing. So those are the barriers created by the government for the intention to create a monopoly market for a firm. So you can easily imagine how a utility company in a state that could be a monopoly or legal monopoly for supplying utility to the households in that state, such as PG&E in California. Well, there is another way how a monopoly can develop in a market. So it's called the economies of scale. So it's similar to what we studied earlier. So the term economies of scale, it's basically describing the scales of productions that can lower the average cost of the firms in the long run. So the economies of scales can actually create a natural monopoly, because when there is one market that only allows one firm to supply to the whole populations in order to drive the cost down to a certain level, when the economies of scales is so large, the firm will need to produce so much in order to drive down the cost. It's not even allowed the second firm to comes in to join selling the product in the market. So in this case, when the market is not big enough for that particular kinds of productions, the economies of scale will drive a natural monopoly to exist. There's another way how a monopoly can actually develop. It's called the controls of physical resources. So one way to think about this is when a firm is selling a product, they need some production inputs to produce that particular product. If there is a product that can actually be produced by certain elements or resources, and the firm actually dominates the supply of that resource, then obviously for other competitors to join the markets to produce the same goods, they have to always buy the production inputs from that one firm. Similarly, in the histories of the world, there are two very famous cases that actually control the physical resources. One is the company called Alcoa, which is a US-based company that produced aluminum. So back in the early 1900s, Alcoa is a very famous company to produce aluminum in the world. And because they are the only one firm who produced the aluminum, and at the same time also dominating the very critical elements that produce aluminum, which the element is called bauxite. And they were able to dominate the whole markets for aluminum products back in the time. Well, another very famous company is called De Beers. So De Beers is a diamond productions firm where they mostly have their diamonds productions take place in South Africa. So De Beers actually figured out if they want to drive the competitor off the markets, one way to do it is to dominate all the resources of diamonds. So that's why they actually bought a lot of lands in South Africa, because, well, South Africa is the country where majority of the diamonds actually it's discovered in the recent decades. Well, in order to control the supply of diamonds, and they are able to control the markets of diamonds. So we have talked about several types of monopolies with the barrier to entries described. Now we would like to also discover how a monopolist is facing a different demand to what we study in the perfect competitive firm. So a monopolist, it's usually what we call a price searcher. Well, they are the price searchers in the markets because the firm will have to face the whole market demand. Unlike the perfect competitive markets, every firm in the perfect competitive market is facing a fixed price, which is formed by the market equilibrium. But in the monopoly case, the monopolist is facing the whole market demand, where they have all this flexibility to change the prices of the products. However, one thing worth to note, the demand curve that the monopoly firms face, it's a downward sloping demand curve. So what it means is, if the firm is going to change the price of their products, the quantity demands, the total number of quantity of the product to be demanded in the markets will be different. So there is always a trade-off for monopoly to change the prices. So when the firm charging a higher price, they can only sell less. If the firm has an objective to sell more of the products, well, the only way to do it is to decrease the price of the products. So once we understand the monopolist's demands, well, it helps us to understand the marginal's revenues. So once we have the demand curve of the monopoly firm, we can now derive the marginal revenue curve. So as you can see in this example, we have the P and the Q columns here representing the demand curve, the green lines. To calculate the total revenues, we can always use the marginal, the price of the products times the quantity of the products. As you can see, the total revenue column, it's basically the product of the first two. And now to calculate the marginal revenues, it's also easy. We are basically using the difference between the total revenue divided by the difference between the quantity. So the first one we get here is 4, which is coming from 9 minus 5 divided by 2 minus 1. Well, the second marginal revenue is 3 because we have 12 minus 9 divided by 3 minus 2. So as you can see, the marginal revenue in this case, it's not equals to the price like what we've seen in the perfect competitive markets case. The marginal revenue curve is going to be a downward sloping one. It will be a curve always under the demand curve. And the intuitions here is, if the firm, they want to sell one more units in the market, they have to lower the price for each unit that they are going to produce. So for instance, when the firm is currently selling 2 units, they can actually charge $4.50 for each one they sell in the market. However, when the firm is trying to sell a total of 3 units in the market, not only the first 2 units, they have to reduce the price to $4. So the third ones also needs to reduce to $4. So the firm cannot actually sell the prior products or the prior quantity at a higher price and assume that people will buy the third ones at $4. So the demand curve basically show you, well, what is the price charge in the markets and the quantity demands of the products. So that's why when the firms start selling more and more quantity, well, the lower the price they have to charge for each unit they produce. And that will have a negative effect to the marginal revenues. So once we derive the marginal revenues of the monopoly firm, well, the rest is very simple. We only need to ask the questions. So when is the monopoly firm going to maximize the profits? What is the output they have to produce, and what is the price they have to charge? Well, in this example here, we are basically using the demand curve and the marginal revenue curve to demonstrate that the profit maximizing decisions should be where the marginal cost equals to marginal revenue, which is the intercept of the MR curve and the MC curve. That will demonstrate the total quantity of outputs that the firm should produce in this market. And in this case, firm is going to produce quantity outputs of Q, but they are not going to charge a price where the intercept happens. They're going to charge the maximum price that people are willing to pay in the market, which is the quantity that associated with the point on the demand curve, which is price P. And sometimes we call price P the monopoly price. Well, since the monopolist, it's always going to charge a price that is greater than the marginal cost. And that's why the monopolist, it's not resource allocated efficiency. Well, is the monopoly always going to be the ones that earn profits? To be honest, well, if you actually looking at this graph, where you'll find the profit maximizing output Q and the monopoly price P, combining with the average total cost curve of the firm, well, in this particular case, obviously the monopoly firm is earning a positive economic profit. However, you have to always recognize there's always going to be a case where the monopoly firm might be selling a profit maximizing outputs Q and charging a monopoly price P, where the average total cost at that level of outputs is higher than the price that the monopoly is charging. So in this case, the monopoly firm is actually making a negative economic profits. So keep that in mind, monopoly firm is not automatically going to earn profits in the markets. It really depends on the combinations of the demand of the products and the cost of the productions. So in the short runs, obviously, the monopoly firm could possibly earn a positive economic profits. But we would like to also ask the questions. So is it possible for the monopoly firm to actually run the productions in the short runs, but they are not making a positive economic profit? So the answer is yes. Well, similar to our analysis in the perfect competitive market setting. It is possible that the monopoly firm is charging a monopoly price P, where the price is actually between the average total cost and the average variable cost. So in this case, well, even though the monopolist is not making positive profits in the short runs, but they still have to produce in the short runs in order to minimize the loss. But now, there's one interesting question. So what happened in the long run in this case? So unfortunately, a monopoly firm facing a economic loss in the short runs, they will most likely not be able to make any profits in the long run either. So remember, one way how a perfect competitive markets firm or perfect competitive firm to make profits in the long run is they are hoping that they can actually take the advantage of economy of scales in the long run by expanding the operations to reduce the total cost on average. Well, if the monopoly firm is trying to take the advantage of economy of scales by producing more, well, there is a problem. As the productions expand, that means, well, the firm will have to sell more in the long runs. So the quantity of outputs they have to produce will be much larger. But they are facing a fixed demands, market demands in this particular market setting. So what it suggests is when the firm start producing more to take advantage of economy of scale by expanding, they need to sell more in the markets. And the only way for a monopoly firm to sell more of the products in the long run is to lower the price in the long run. And unfortunately, there will never be a case where the price will be able to reduce or decrease slower in the markets than the average total cost. So most likely what happen is the average total cost will decrease in the short runs, in the long runs. However, the price will drop even faster. So in this case, well, obviously, the monopoly firm who is earning a negative economic profits in the short runs, they will also be earning a negative economic profits in the long run too. So that means, well, in the long runs, this monopoly firm will definitely exceed the markets. Well, some of the outcomes that we have talked about so far. Well, the monopoly firm will always charge a price that is greater than the marginal cost as we derive. The profits of the monopoly firm will most likely be positive in the long run, because we have talked about if they are only making a negative economic profits, they won't be staying in the business in the long run. And a positive economic profits basically means that the price it's always going to be greater than the average total cost in the long run. And that also implies that the price will always be greater than the minimum of the average total cost in the long run. And one sad thing about this duration here is the firm will almost never guarantee to produce efficiently in the markets. So that's why waste is possible. So in general, the firm will not be resource allocator efficient, and also the firm will not be productive efficient. Well, if we want to compare the efficiency between the monopoly firm and also perfect competitive firm, you can actually use a very simple visual plots here to demonstrate. So first of all, we are plotting out the perfect competition's surplus for the consumers and the producers. So we are assuming that there is a market demand, which is the green lines in this graph, and we assume that the firm or firms who produce in this market actually has the same production scales, which take the forms of this horizontal marginal cost curve. And this marginal cost is equals to the average total cost. So in a perfect competitive market, all the firms will keep producing until the market's reaching to the output level, which is QPC here, where the price is equal to the marginal cost. And in the long run, price also equals to the average total cost in a perfect competitive settings. So the consumer surplus, it's basically represented by these blue triangles in the graph. And since the perfect competitive firm will not earn any positive economic profits in the long run, so there will be no productive or producer surplus to be captured in this market. Now, if we think about the monopoly market, where the firm is going to produce where MR equal MC, which is the output level QM, and charging a monopoly price PM in the market, the consumer surplus is going to reduce to this green triangle on the top. So obviously, a significantly decrease in consumer surplus in the market. And what happened is, well, the producer surplus is going to be changed because, well, now the monopoly firm will be able to capture the profits from this market. So the general idea is we will have a deadweight loss in this monopoly markets as compared to the perfect comparative markets. And this deadweight loss is represented by these yellow triangles. The monopoly profits in this case will be the purple rectangles in this graph. Well, since the monopoly firm is making profits in this case, so that's why they are able to capture the producer surplus with this purple rectangle. But comparing to the perfect comparative markets, obviously, this yellow triangle, the deadweight loss, is basically caused by the reductions of transactions in the markets. The monopoly firm intentionally trying to produce less in order to drive the profits in the markets. So that's why the total loss here, it's basically coming from the consumers only. Well, we have used the producer and consumer surplus analysis to demonstrate the loss of the welfare in the markets. But there are some other social costs that we have to also be aware. Well, in the monopoly case, it's very likely that the monopoly firm will engage in something that we call a rent-seeking activities. So a rent-seeking activity, it's basically a general term to describe how a monopoly firm will devote their resources into securing their positions in the markets. And in most cases, monopoly will spend a whole lot of their resources in order to influence the public policy, in order to basically maintain the positions in the markets. Some of this action is basically called lobbying. So lobbying is a very common practice for a monopoly firm, where the monopoly firm is trying to convince the government agency to pass or maybe to avoid some of the public policy that affects the profits of the monopoly firm. Well, in general, we basically think that, well, this is a waste of resources. And the social economist, Dr. Trulotz, actually make a point where because the monopolist firm are spending these resources lobbying with the government agency, and it's not devoting the resources in productions. So we can actually treat this as some kind of social loss from a monopoly market. Well, there's another problem with the monopoly markets, which is called inefficiency. So unlike the perfect competitive settings, the monopolist firm is always running the markets with profits in the short run and the long run guarantee because there is a high barrier to entry. No competitor will be fighting against them, so that's why there is no needs and no incentive or motivations for the monopoly firm to actually adapt to more efficient productions. As long as profit is possible, the firm will not devote any resources into investing into a new types of productions or adapting to a more environmental friendly productions that benefits others. And we call this an inefficiency. Well, we have talked about so much of the disadvantage of the monopoly markets, and we would like to raise the questions. If we're only getting the bad thing out of the monopoly markets, how come we do have the monopoly market exist in the modern world? Or, to be a little bit more iconic about these questions, how come the monopoly market is the one that truly exists in the world but not the perfect comparative markets, if the perfect comparative market is the one that generates the most benefits? Well, even the governments would like to promote monopoly sometimes, and we have to understand it has to come with the reasons. So why is the government, or maybe why the monopoly market actually has its own place to stand? Well, there are a couple of reasons to believe that the monopoly is not only generating the social cost to our or loss of welfare in the markets. There are some benefits that the monopolists actually bring to the tables. So number one, if you think about the difference between the monopoly markets and the perfect competitive markets, firms in the perfect competitive markets do not have resources to spend on innovations. Whereas compared to monopoly markets, the monopoly firm will always have the profits. And the profits in the short run or the long runs can be utilized and trying to invest on new inventions or innovations. And that's one key motivations for the government to promote monopoly markets in certain industries, such as the entertainment industries or the creative industries. People who create songs or writing poems or creating applications, they are all protected by copyrights and patent law. Well, in order for these people or innovators to actually be innovative again in the economy, we have to suggest them that there is a benefit for them to do it. By securing their profits in the markets, it's one very big incentive or financial incentive for the innovator in the markets to actually create new products or come up with new ideas. Well, another benefits that you can imagine is think about the economy of scales. If we have this one industry where there are many people buying the products, but we don't actually need two firms to supply it, then why do we actually need two firms from the very beginning? So sometimes governments want to reduce the repeated resources used to serve in a single market, when one firm can actually drive the cost of the productions to the lowest by itself to supply the products in the market, we probably don't need another firm to jump in and split the market into half, because we know when firms producing less in the long runs, they are basically going back up on the heels of the economy of scales. They're cutting back on outputs and shrinking. It will only increase the cost in the long runs. And of course, well, another advantage is the monopoly firm can allocate more resources to research and developments in the long runs, comparing to other market structures, because they are the one who actually hold the most resources when they're getting profits from the markets. So all of this could be a benefits or social benefits that actually compensates the cost or the social cost caused by the monopolists in the markets. So in the next videos, we are going to talk about the price discrimination strategy by the monopoly firm. Well, please review your textbook readings, and I will see you guys in the next videos.